All right. So this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 2, Section 1, Portuguese Exploration and Spanish Conquest. So before in Chapter 1, we talked about the three parts of the world that created or made up the Atlantic world. That was, of course, Africa, the New World or Native Americans, and Europeans. In this chapter here, we're going to talk more about and in greater detail how all these worlds interacted with one another, specifically in the Americas. So when we look at Portugal, Portugal was the pioneer of the Age of Exploration. They were one of the first nations to begin exploring well beyond their borders. This was thanks to, in part, like Prince Henry the Navigator, who was a Portuguese prince who had built a school and had dedicated much of his resources and funds and money to training people so they knew how to do things like ship build, create maps, navigate in the open waters, etc., etc. For Portugal, though, their success in this age of exploration comes mostly from trading posts and what we call quote-unquote strategic holdings. That is, they're very much interested in commerce. And although Portugal has very limited New World possessions, specifically Brazil, for the most part, most of the money being made by Portugal is in Asia, with things like the spice trade, right? This is where the Portuguese make most of their money. So the Portuguese are less interested in conquering large areas of land, less interested in conquering a large number of people. That's mostly because they run into obstacles in the old world. Instead, they're focused more on commerce, trading posts, etc., etc. We also know that the Portuguese are also trading in Western Africa, commodities like slaves, ivory, gold, the construction of Portuguese factories, bring African slaves to Brazil, specifically to grow sugar. Again, when we think of sugar, we want to think specifically of African slavery and how that arrives in the New World. In fact, this image right here is a picture of a Portuguese factory built by Portugal on the west coast of Africa, one of these strategic trading points, but was later on taken over by the Dutch. If you notice this flag here, this flag is actually a Dutch flag, starting roughly around the 1600s. Around that particular period of time, the Dutch began to take over some of Portugal's strategic trading posts, including those that facilitate African slavery. So even though Portugal is the nation to bring some of the first African slaves to the New World, it's the Dutch or the Netherlands in the 1600s mostly that begin to kind of take that over. And by the time you get to the 1600s, most African slaves are being brought over on Dutch slave ships. Now for Spain, Spain is interested in something a little bit different than Portugal. Portugal is mostly geared towards the East, Africa and Asia, really leaving the New World completely open to Spanish conquest. And because the Spanish don't really have to worry about the Portuguese so much, their only obstacles in the conquest more or less is the New World itself. So they're oriented a little bit differently than Portugal. They're not just interested in trade, but the Spanish also become interested in conquest, taking over lands, taking over people, etc., etc. Now, in Chapter 1, we had already talked a little bit about some of the reasons how Spanish exploration got underway. So real quick, Ferdinand and Isabella, two rulers of two separate kingdoms, created a unified Spain. So at this point, the Spanish kingdom or the Kingdom of Spain was united both politically and in terms of religion, right? So Spain is united in terms of just one king and queen, Ferdinand and Isabella, united in terms of religion. It completed the Reconquista, which was the expulsion of Muslim rulers from the Iberian Peninsula. The last Muslim rulers were pushed off, And of course, Spanish motivation includes culture, like spreading the Catholic faith in the Catholic Church, and commerce, aka money, especially over their rivals, Portugal. We also talked about how Christopher Columbus came to the New World in Chapter 1, that initially he hoped to sail west to reach India to get things like trade goods. He miscalculated the size of the world, and on October 12, 1492, sailing on his 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, he arrived rather on the island of Hispaniola than where he believed, which was Asia or India. So if we look at this very early map here that is provided by the text, first of all, we have this image up here. This is a Spanish map of the island of Hispaniola that is in fact located, we'll use green. If we look at this map, that's actually located right here, right here. So if you're trying to figure out what is what on this thing, that's Spain, that's Africa, and this is the coast of South America. This is Florida. Again, this is a primary source. It was created, I believe, let me check. This was a map created by, it doesn't say who, but it was European, didn't say specifically the country. Where Columbus was hoping to reach would have been some islands located over here, right? So hoping to reach this area, instead landed there. Now, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, who funded his voyage, when Columbus returns, what are they expecting from him? They're expecting essentially trade goods. Can Columbus make good on that promise? No, he can't provide trade goods, and instead says, and on his subsequent voyages, if we go down here for 1 second, Columbus comes back empty-handed, doesn't have trade goods from Asia because he never got to Asia. And even though Christopher Columbus never fully understood where he was, others would, he promised that he could bring back gold and slaves, right? That in the region and the people that he interacted with, the people that he interacted with were the Taínos. The Taínos, Christopher Columbus had mistaken for people who lived in the East Indies, referred to them as Indians, which is a term that has ever since stuck. Columbus returned back to the New World with news of his discovery, and it didn't take very long for other people in Spain and other people in Europe to realize that Columbus had in fact not reached Asia, but had reached something new, hence the term New World, and hence the term discovery, even though there were already people inhabiting the New World at the particular time. And so subsequent Spanish conquistadors, so conquistadors is a Spanish conqueror, right, sought to obtain probonzo de merito, or proof of merit, otherwise known as a proof of discovery. And a proof of discovery was something that a Spanish explorer or Spanish conquistador could provide a royal subject, like a king or queen, in an effort to try to earn patronage, which is money. And so the way that Spanish discovery and Spanish conquest of the New World operated was that a Spanish king, queen, prince, whatever, would grant a conquistador, mostly the Spanish king, would grant a conquistador the rights and perhaps also the resources after proving discovery to extract whatever the land could provide. And in most cases, such as was the case with Columbus, that was gold and slaves. And so even though there weren't any trade goods, there was no spices, there was no porcelain, there weren't any of the things that Columbus initially looked for, the New World could provide Spain with a source of income via these two things, right? Gold and slaves. It was later on the Italian Amerigo Vespucci who more or less is the one who is credited with, well, we get the word America from Amerigo Vespucci, and the reason why he gets the credit and not Columbus was not just because he was the first to recognize that this was in fact something new. Others did. But he had created a map, a very popular map. And in that map, Vespucci was credited with discovering this new world, which became known as the Americas, North and South America. So a map maker gets credit for, or gets his name on these two new continents. And so in the aftermath of this, right, you essentially had this rivalry between Spain and Portugal. Spain, even though they didn't find what they were initially looking for, did have a source of wealth in the New World. Portugal did find what they were looking for, had a source of wealth in the Old World. And the two, for the most part, were satisfied with their findings. And so the two agreed to a treaty with one another known as the Treaty of Tortosia. So this is a treaty between Spain and Portugal. And essentially what this treaty did, if we look back at the map right here, was that it drew a line about right here, right? This was the Treaty of Tortosia's line. Everything on this side belonged to Portugal. Everything on this side belonged to Spain. And so all this territory here, Mesoamerica, North America, most of South America, lie in Spanish control. Portugal then gets to claim their trading posts in Western Africa. They had developed trading posts in Eastern Africa. They developed trading posts in India and Southeast Asia. That was all Portuguese, including a small segment of Brazil. So if you're curious as to why pretty much everywhere in Central and South America people speak Spanish, but in Brazil they speak Portuguese, it's because of this treaty that was created 500 years ago. Pretty crazy to think how something 500 years ago continues to have an impact on our world today. And so with that, with no worry about Portuguese interference, essentially the floodgates opened and Spanish conquistadors poured into the Americas, poured into the New World, looking for land and gold. A saying that went along with Spanish conquest of the New World was glory, gold, and God, right? The three G's with really sort of pushed Spanish exploration, or Spanish conquest, I should say. The two most significant Spanish conquistadors for us, and I'll go ahead and make this point again. Columbus did go back to the New World. He went back at least three more times, right? He had 4 total voyages. And so typically we're familiar with the story of Columbus in 1492 and discovering the New World. What we often don't hear are these subsequent voyages in which Columbus did go back to plunder, to conquer, take slaves, bring them back to the Old World, etc., etc. But in terms of the most important conquistadors, Hernán Cortés certainly is one of them. He is perhaps the most consequential of all the conquistadors. Because if we think about Spanish conquest and think about what we've already talked about, we know that the two largest obstacles to Spain's conquest in the New World are the two most sophisticated civilizations. That is the Aztec Empire in Mexico, in Mesoamerica, and that is the Inca Empire in Peru. And in both cases, the respective conquistadors, Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, are successful in conquering both of these empires. So how did it happen? Well, Tenochtitlan was, of course, the Aztec capital. And because the Aztecs had so successfully conquered their neighbors, essentially they extracted all the wealth from the surrounding areas and had built essentially what was a city of gold, right? Or at least that's what it was rumored to be by some of these Spanish explorers. Hernán Cortés, who was a governor of Cuba at the time, heard rumors of this vast city, the city of gold, went out with a small group of men in search of plunder, in search of conquest. He happened to come upon the Aztec ruler, Montezuma. So Montezuma is the Aztec emperor. Cortés himself was invited into Tenochtitlan, later took Montezuma hostage. The Spanish presence in the Aztec capital did not rub the Aztecs the right way. In fact, they rose up in rebellion. In that rebellion, Montezuma, actually at the time Montezuma II, Montezuma was killed by the Spanish authorities. But at least in the meantime, the Aztec rebellion, which rose up, had successfully pushed Spain out of the capital city, right? So Cortez initially capturing the Aztec emperor, holding him hostage. The Aztecs rise up in rebellion and kick Cortez and his men out. Montezuma is killed in that altercation. However, Cortez was not done. In fact, he successfully recaptures or reconquers the Aztec capital, and this was due to two reasons. Two things that Cortez was able to do. First, because the Aztecs had such strained relations with their neighbors, remember the Aztecs were about war and were about sacrifice. When Cortez and his men returned to reconquer or to conquer Tenochtitlan once again, he had more Native American allies in his army than he actually had Spaniards. And these were people who were looking to get revenge against the Aztecs. Also, something else that was at work here, and this should be certainly included and certainly mentioned, and perhaps is the most important part here, so I'll put it in a different color, is that when Cortez and his men first occupied the capital city, they had exposed the Aztecs to diseases, right? Diseases, specifically smallpox. And while Cortez and his men were away, smallpox devastated the Aztec population. And so when Cortez and his men and his allies returned, the Aztecs were much more susceptible. Cortez is successful in conquering the city. It is renamed to Mexico City, which serves as the capital of Spain's New World possessions, which is called New Spain, right? So the old Aztec capital, which was captured, destroyed, is renamed to Mexico City, modern-day Mexico City, and is the capital for which the Spanish Empire operates under in the New World. Here we see smallpox mentioned, right? Native resentment and smallpox. That, of course, is related to the conquest, or is mostly responsible for Cortez's conquest. A couple of other points to make here as well. Melintzen, this was a translator, Native American woman who had helped Cortez and his men conquer. There's questions about Melintzen. Was she a victim of the Spaniards? Was she a traitor to her Aztec, her fellow Native Americans or Aztec brethren? Depending on how you may want to interpret that evidence, right? Was she a victim? Was she a traitor? Again, she was the translator for Cortez, Native American woman. And as more and more Spanish conquistadors came, that meant more and more young men. They began to take on Native American wives. And so a new class or a different class of people, mestizos, were increasingly becoming more and more common in the Americas. A mestizo is a mix of Native American and European, right? So these are a class of people who have a mixed ancestry, a mixed bloodline, Native American and European, and are prominent and will be prominent throughout the Spanish Empire due to the nature of Spanish colonization, which typically involved young men coming to the New World. The story of Francisco Pizarro is somewhat similar to what had happened in the Aztecs. Pizarro and a couple hundred Spaniards armed with guns, germs, and steel weapons, which were lacked, of course, in the Americas. There was a huge technological gap between the Inca Empire and the Spanish Empire and people like Pizarro. So these three things are usually attributed to what is why the Spanish were able to be successful. Also, what had happened in the Inca Empire before Pizarro and his men got there, there had been exposure to smallpox as well. So disease was already beginning to ravage the population in the Inca Empire before Pizarro even got there. But the story was pretty similar. Pizarro and his men captured the Incan emperor, Atahualpa. And much like what had happened to Montezuma II, Atahualpa was also killed by the Spanish conquistadors, Francisco Pizarro, right, who's responsible for that. So with that, both the Aztec and Inca, the two most powerful and sophisticated civilizations in the New World, both of them fell at the hands of the Spanish. Now, Spain is focused in their colonization of the New World primarily in South America. However, the Spanish do have influence in North America as well. When it comes to it, the Spanish presence in North America, many like Hernán de Soto and Francisco Coronado essentially went searching for the same things that all Spanish conquistadors did, and that was glory, gold, and God. And the fact that both the Aztec and the Inca empires had produced a lot of wealth, I mean, the plunder that Pizarro and Cortez were able to extract, or did extract, from both the Aztecs and the Inca was so much that De Soto and Coronado explored essentially all throughout North America in search of similar empires. Now, we know that there were no other empires comparable to the Aztecs and the Incas that were present in North America at the time. De Soto and Coronado didn't know that, but they went searching for it, right? They went searching for the city of El Dorado, which is partially inspired by these events here. De Soto created a Spanish presence in the southeast of the U.S. This is Florida. We'll talk more about Spanish presence in Florida. Francisco Coronado, who you see, and his explorations on this map here. He was one of the first Europeans to set eyes on the Grand Canyon. He was mostly involved in New Mexico. So we'll come back to this, but it's important to understand that at least in the meantime, that Spain does have a presence in North America. It's not their focal point. It's not a big presence, but you do have Spanish speakers, Spanish Catholic missionaries in Florida and New Mexico, right? Florida and New Mexico. This conquest of the New World allowed for a Spanish golden age. Now, initially, while most of the wealth that Spain extracted from the New World was in the form of gold and was in the form of plunder, soon the Spanish found natural resources in silver mines. So when it comes to Spain and their primary way of making wealth or making money in the New World, initially it's plunder, then it's silver. Silver is a major source of wealth for the Spanish Empire. The Habsburg dynasty, which was the ruler of the Spanish Empire, which now included territories like North and South America. It included Spain. It included vast possessions in Europe. It included places in Asia like the Philippines, which we hadn't talked about. This golden age put Spain, and the discovery of the New World put Spain as one of Europe's preeminent powers, right? It made them king of the hill, so to speak. That's how valuable and wealthy this and rich the New World was. This also allowed for more resources to pour into things like art and literature. Here we have a painting from the Spanish Renaissance, which is a literature and cultural flourishing, one of the most well-known and best works of literature ever created. Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes was also created as a result of this influx of wealth, right? So think about the Spanish Renaissance and the cultural output that Spain put and the power of the Habsburg dynasty as being a direct result of Spanish conquest in the New World.